when we read our Bibles and then we rise up from our table or chair where we are and we think about the world, do we think there's a disconnect between God and the nation we live in? We think about man trying at the very beginning, trying to make a name for himself, and God divided them up by languages so they would spread across the world. He's not going to be central people, but over the face of the earth. Does he quit caring about nations when he scattered them? He made one of every nation, Acts 17:26, so that everybody would seek after God. Does he not care about nations? He cared about Nineveh. Sent a man, a prophet, to save them, and righteousness becomes a very important part of any nation. Righteousness exalteth the nation, of sin is indeed a shame to any people, not just God's people, any people. God created all mankind. All mankind live in nations. Does he not care about the government? Does he not care about those nations and the character of its leaders? You'd have a hard time proving that to me from the Bible. And just because Jesus has come and been raised and is ascended upon high, did God quit dealing with the nations when he had set up his kingdom in heaven? Isn't it interesting that he did not set up a kingdom on earth? He had them in Jerusalem. That's where his temple was. That's where his presence was. But when he set up his spiritual kingdom and Jesus has ascended upon high, waiting to come one last time, we find that he set us still in nations with civil government, and we're to obey the governmental authorities when they do not contradict with God. God is concerned with individuals being saved for eternity. But people live in nations, and God is still ruling among nations. Did he ever rule among nations? We could see many ideas and thoughts from the Bible, but in Daniel, the 9th chapter, in verses 25 following, there was many Tico Upharsin. What in the world does that mean? Daniel describes it for us and defines it for us, and he defined it for the ruler at that time of Babylon. Many means, mene means that you have been found wanting. By whom? God. We're Babylon. We're not Judah. You have been found wanting, and God is bringing an end to your kingdom. We have numbered you. Tico means you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Upharsin comes from the word pires, which means that indeed you will be divided. You'll be divided between the Medes and the Persians. Babylon, you're going down. But we're Babylon. We're not Judah. God, you're bringing us to an end. God rules in the kingdom of men. That's Daniel's prophecy. But tonight I would like us to ask ourselves the question, if God does rule over nations, he raises nations up and brings them down. He can continue to do that today with our nation. If that's true, could you tell me from God's word, preacher, what does God's sovereign judgment over the nations, could you tell me what it looks like? Could you tell me what it looks like? I say I can. Because there were prophets that received visions. And Ezekiel is one of them. In Ezekiel, the 1st chapter, it was in the 30th year, and yet it was in the 5th year of being in captivity. What was the 30th year? Authorities say that it may have gone back to the time which would fit in 593 BC. It would fit with when Josiah found the law of God and then began to make provisions and changes. We know they didn't change the people's heart, but they changed their ways. And Ezekiel, being a priest and carrying about God's law, In the 30th year, when there could have been reform, I can see Ezekiel thinking in terms that way, but he also in that same context is the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. That's when Ezekiel and Daniel and others had gone into captivity at different times. 586 BC has not occurred when it'll be the final destruction of Jerusalem. But his book opens with a vision. Now we could say Daniel the 5th chapter, where we just saw the writing on the wall, that was a vision. They could see that. It really was occurring. But we can visualize that handwriting, and you've been found wanting. God's bringing you to an end. You're going to be divided among other nations. That's what God does with nations, against nations. But is he having all sovereign rule? And if it does, what does it look like? Not in how it's applied, but what does that particular concept about God, what does it look like? And you're going to see it this evening. Because we see Ezekiel receiving the vision. Why would he receive this vision to begin with? Because he's in captivity. And there are people, since they have Jehoiachin, and when you read Kings, in fact, Jehoiachin's is there eating from the king's table. They didn't think there was just going to be a short time. There were teachers teaching. It's not going to be too long. And yet Ezekiel was to know it's going to be, just like Jeremiah said, it's going to be 70 years. And he was dealing with the false teachers of that day. Indeed, God's judgment is coming upon his people. It's not going to be just a little hiccup. It's going to bring judgment upon you to wake you up, my people. But Babylon is coming. And so the beginning of his book, who's in charge of the nations? God is. And in this first chapter, we see that glory. And it's divided into 4 scenes, 4 visions. Let's see if we can see the first one. And it's the idea of judgment is coming. How does he say it's coming? I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came out of where? The north. And a great cloud with fire enfolding itself. It's rolling. Do you see that? Rolling. You live in West Texas, you can see that. If you've been in Afghanistan, you can see that. The rolling dust clouds coming and folding upon itself. And it's coming from the north. That's where Babylon was. And Ezekiel sees that. Now he's in Babylon. So it's not that, well, we see these things, these literal, and here's a rolling thunder, that must be the enemy coming. No, that's a vision. But what did it mean? What does it mean that this enfolding cloud is coming from the north? A great cloud that's enfolding itself. That's what he saw. I'm suggesting to you that what's coming is judgment. As Jeremiah does more than one time in his book. He speaks about the north. From the north is coming the kingdom. It's coming the judgment from the nations. And we know that in real life and real application, what's symbolically set forth here is going to be fulfilled in Babylon, coming from the northeast to destroy Judah and Jerusalem. Judgment is coming. And God is calling it in. And that is the first thing he says. I looked and saw a stormy wind out of the north, a great cloud with fire enfolding itself, a brightness round about it, and out of it, in the midst of it, were glowing metal out of the midst of the fire. Stay with me. Because I don't think this is a flying saucer. And yet there are many people that do. That Ezekiel saw into the future, and there would be flying saucers. And we're ripe for that in our country. We're finally found out there are UFOs. We're going to have to admit it. And the metal glowing, and all of this about a flying saucer. No. It's like unto this. And what we begin to see in the second place is that we're going to see four living creatures. Because in this glowing metal roundabout, he says, and out of the midst thereof came the likeness. He didn't say these are four living creatures. It's the likeness. It's symbolical language. It's apocalyptic type literature that we see in Revelation. But what we need to grasp, what does it mean? What does it mean? And the four living creatures here come out. And their appearance was as likeness of a man. Everyone had four faces, and every one of them had four wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet were the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkle like burnished brass, like they've been over hot coals, coming in judgment. And begin to say, well, what do those creatures, well, they're living. And what do they say? They see the face of a man. Living creatures, they were created. By whom? God. And they are here to do God's bidding. And one of the things that are exalted among God's creation, the living creatures, is man. There's the intelligence in the face of a man. There's also the strength of a lion. We call him the king of the jungle, but there is indeed that honor and power and strength. That's part of his creation. It's all giving glory to God who created them. There's also the face of service as the ox. Faithful service, day in, day out. And the oxen were used in order to take care of serving mankind, serving their needs. There's the face of an eagle. Sometimes we think how swift, but ride high. It's the highness of his creatures. There's a glory connected with how high they rise, how majestic they are. That's part of God's creature. None of those are God's. None of them you bow your knee to. None of them you make an image and say, there's my God. But they manifest the greatness of God's glory in his creation. They're all distinct. One is made in the image of God, the others are not, but they are marvelous creatures. And what is happening? There's something that occurs here that I think is very important. The burning coals of fire. In verse 12 and 13, they went everyone straight forward. They got a mission. And they're under God's command with the intelligence and strength and service that offering unto God, the highest order of service and the highest and the greatest, maybe more spiritual, that type of highness of getting the work done. And they turned not when they went. And as for the likeness of the living creatures, what do I see? Ezekiel saw, he said, appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. The fire went up and down among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. So quick, while the eagle's swiftness may be there. But there was the brightness of coal. When Isaiah became a prophet, he was a man of unclean lips, and the seraphim, those who are serving around, those creatures are serving around God's throne, took a coal from the altar and touched his tongue so that his tongue would be cleansed of his sin. And coals of burning fire. And wherever they go, there's holiness connected with their service unto their Creator. And they go up and down and up and down. They don't have to turn, they're there. But they're doing God's bidding on the standpoint of God's holiness. And they're totally separated unto fulfilling God's will. Jerusalem was not destroyed. by lions. They weren't trampled by oxen. They weren't pecked to death by an eagle. It's God directing the things that happen. And God's greatest part of what He has created in heaven and upon earth is able to reach heaven and reach earth and go about bringing about God's ways that honor His character as being a holy God. Being a holy God. And that's one thing every nation needs to think about. God is holy, and He's in control of your kingdom, even when you do not acknowledge Him. Nebuchadnezzar, do you remember what it was like to eat grass as oxen? Feathers like a bird? Nails long like an eagle? He remembered it. He wrote about it. It's God. And these things in history, in times of history, realize God, you're in control, not me. And yet he was just so full of pride. It was all about him before that happened. God brings in time to help us understand He's in control. And here is Him using the greatness of what He has created. And He's bringing about the judgment that is going to come upon the people. So He sees, this is glory, the highest part of God's creation. Verses 15 through 21, we see wheels. And a lot of different ideas come from this. The wheel is within a wheel. And they don't turn. But they go east, west, north, south without turning. And they're rising up and they're rising down. They go from heaven, they go to earth. God is in control of heaven and earth. And so we see, I behold the living creatures, behold one wheel upon the earth beside the living creatures, for each of the four faces thereof. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto a barrel, and they four had one likeness. And their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel within a wheel. Wheel within a wheel. Well, you could kind of put them within a wheel. But think about it. They never have to turn, and they can go all directions simultaneously. See, God sees everything. Well, you think he sees everything? Well, and as for the rims, they were high and dreadful. Oh, I get it. And the four had rims full of eyes round about. We're not talking about a flying saucer. We're talking about God's omniscience, all-knowing, all-seeing. We're studying Habakkuk. God, don't you see what's happening in Judah? He needs to see this vision. And he had to learn that God sees it. I'm bringing a nation to discipline my people. I see it. And we need to remember, God sees everything. There's nothing that is hidden from His eyes. And that can be a glorious thing in Psalm 139. He sees me in my womb, when I was in my unformed substance. There's not anywhere I can go that I can escape God, and I like that. I like to be comforted by that fact. Or it could be a scary thing. But eyes around, and when we read Revelation, and we read that'll be the thing you'll think about first. Because eyes are in the rim, and the creatures are within the wheels. They're going up and they're going down. They're going to do God's service, and you know what it's all about? Is that God sees it all simultaneously. These wheels don't turn. They're there. East, west, north, and south. And whether they're up in heaven or on earth, God's in control of that. And that's what He's setting forth. In verses 22 through 28, we see the last part of this vision, and above where those wheels go up and down, there's a firmament, there's a space there, and there's a throne above that. And over the head of the living creature there was the likeness of a firmament, like the terrible crystal to look upon, stretched forth over their heads above. And under the firmament there were wings straight, the one toward the other, every one, two which were covered on this side, and every one, two which was covered on that side, their bodies. There's the holiness, there's a shame in the sense of not pleasing God. And there was a sense of we're in the presence of God. We're living creatures, we're exalted because we get to do God's bidding. But they were reverential, because who's above it all? It's one that looked like a man on his throne. That's not saying that it's not God. It's like man identifying with man. And he says, and when they went, I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of great waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a noise of tumult like the noise of a host when they stood and they set down their wings. There was a voice above the firmament that was over their heads. When they stood, they let down their wings. And above the firmament there was over their heads was the likeness of a throne. And in the appearance of a sapphire stone. And upon the likeness of the throne was a likeness as the appearance of a man. How many times does he tell you it's likeness, it's likeness? I want you to get the picture. It's not it, it's like it. And I saw as it were glowing metal, as the appearance of fire within it round about, from the appearance of his loins upward and from the appearance of his loins downward. He's acting, and fire's coming, judgment, upon nations. And what is ready to happen on earth has already been determined up in heaven. The wheels are moving up and down simultaneously. He sees all things at one time. And he's bringing the fire of judgment. And he says, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness round about him, and as the appearance of something else. So he sees this brightness. He sees the throne, God's ruling judgment in heaven and earth. And the wheels go up and they go down. They go up and down. Simultaneously, heaven, earth. But there's the I'm in control. He didn't see something that didn't recognize ruling. He saw a throne. An appearance of a man above it, having the appearance of a man. Didn't say wasn't God. And I saw as it were glowing metal. There's our gotta be a flying saucer, man. No. Metal as the appearance of fire within it, around about it, from the appearance of his loins upward. So I saw there was fire, and the brightness round about. And then verse 28, as the appearance of the bowl that is in the cloud. With all his fire, with all of this authority, simultaneously seeing things with his omniscience. What does he see there? There's a bowl. What does that mean? Appearance of the bowl, there's in the cloud in the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Jehovah. Now, you can manifest the glory of Jehovah in a lot of ways. But what do we take from all of these visions? A rainbow that's above that. What was that rainbow? I know a bow in the cloud in Genesis the 9th chapter, in verses 14 through 15, is that God is making a covenant with mankind. He will not destroy the world by water again. And when a rain comes, he puts that bow in the cloud to show I am going to be faithful to my promises. And there's also a sense of mercy with that. I will not destroy the world by water, but we've learned this morning, he will destroy the earth with fire. He has it, doesn't he? Fire glowing in and out, loins filled with fire up at the top of his body to loins. I'm acting. I can bring judgment. But with the rainbow, there's a sense of mercy. in Habakkuk, the book that we're studying. Notice in chapter 3 when Habakkuk is trying to grasp hold the fact that God is going to bring judgment upon a wicked Jerusalem and Judah. He's also going to bring judgment upon a prideful Babylonian power. He says in chapter 3 and verse 2, O Jehovah, I've heard the report of thee, and I'm afraid. O Jehovah, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. I know you're coming. And we see what Ezekiel will see, what he sees. I see the fire of loins. He's moving and fire's coming. And we're not going to stop that. There comes a time, and maybe Josiah had found it 30 years ago, and that law is, no, they're not following it. And there comes a time when that judgment is coming. It's not going to be something partial that we're going to be taught in Jeremiah's day and Ezekiel's. And what Habakkuk knew is that God is coming in judgment upon his people and the Chaldeans. But he says, remember mercy in the midst of your wrath. And God says, look at my rainbow. Look at my rainbow. Now see, I distinguish this from the end of time judgment, where we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, not be destroyed personally by a nation. They begin to see that here is God's answer to what does it look like for the glory of God to be sovereign in judgment upon nations. That happens in time. Our judgment is connected with eternity. And it's individual, not nationwide. So I've set that over here. And what can I gain from seeing, yes, he does care about nations. And in time, which we're still in, he can bring one nation and take over another nation. And it's interesting, what makes them able to be taken over is internal corruption. And that was, well, Rome fell because of internal corruption. What's internal corruption? Is that people no longer serve God in their hearts, and therefore not in their lives. Righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people, even our country, the nation we're living in. You think this has happened by chance? This little experiment called freedom? You know, I don't see any indication that would be. You think about just how come we have a country like this. You look about the founding and all the things connected with the timing of it all. You think that just happened by chance? I don't. I know God has not quit thinking about nations either. He brought Rome down after he'd already set up his church. And he can bring any nation down. What can I learn from this? Nations fall in time. And how should I, as an individual citizen of any nation upon earth, how should I think about this vision? Well, our enemies can come from the north. They can come from all sorts of directions. And God, with the highest order of his creation, of service, of the highest order of highest, you can't get any higher than flight of an eagle. The intelligence of his creature called man. He created it all. He's behind it all. And he's behind all of the judgments that come upon nations. He brings them down. And we see it over and over and over again in our prophets. But as Habakkuk will say, remember mercy. God will. Let's say that we are conquered from within and there's no more righteousness left in us, that God allows us to crumble to nothing. And what we prayed for tonight, we're glad we had the freedom to worship. That can be taken away just with another COVID scare. It can be taken away real quickly. And many people will not resist it because we're afraid it's for the goodness of everybody. And we need to realize that that can happen so quickly. What happens if there is persecution and people who despise God come in and disrupt our worship? It could get worse than that. They could take the preacher, behead him on stage. Take the elders and do that. That can happen. But in the midst of all of that, individually, we need to be grasping. What Ezekiel saw is that nations fall, and I know why. And God, I know you're in control of what's happening now. But I know you'll be faithful to your promises in the midst of your judgment. And hopefully that gives you strength to face your death, whoever you are. Because there's a rainbow in that vision. I will be faithful. You be faithful unto death. Even if it means your death, I'll give you the crown of life. That means something when you're about ready to die for the Lord. It's not, I lived a good life. I'm 80-something years old, and now I'm right on to the end. I was faithful. No, even if it means your death. That's what's happening in Revelation. That's what's happening with people under the control of Rome who say, you worship Caesar or you die. It's that real. You worship Allah or you die. And we've got the power to take you over. Not without God, you don't. But God judges nations. And the glory of God is in his holy temple. And yes, he may have brought an enemy, and that rolling cloud is coming, and it's coming from the east. It's coming from nations we thought were so inferior. Oh, we're like Nebuchadnezzar, we're invincible. But God's in control. And what it is these living creatures are about holiness. And when God's people cease to be holy and separated unto God, our nation can fall. But God sees it all. Wheel within a wheel, eyes all around the rim, the living creatures operating up and down with those wheels. They're always there present. God sees it all. He's in control of it all. He's everywhere. But he's ruling from his throne. And there's a rainbow that says, I will fulfill my promises to you. And I'm thinking in terms of time. I'm thinking in terms of what happens with governments. They come and they go, and they become so corrupt that God brings judgment. And that can very well happen anytime. I need to be prepared for that. And what Habakkuk does and what Ezekiel saw should give you strength. That yes, I will lower my head. I will give up my life before I will deny my God. And the last thing I hear with the head cut off may be, Allah is great. But it will not change a God who says, my rainbow's still there. I'm in charge, not Allah. And when you get a hold of that, you face anything that comes your way. Doesn't mean it's not fearful. Doesn't mean you can be a coward at the last minute, Peter. But I've seen God's sovereignty and his rule over the nations. I see it in a rolling cloud. I see it in the highest order of his servants and his creation, going about doing his bidding. I see it in the wheel within the wheel with the eyes, that his omniscience is over there. He knows what's going on. And he's a holy God, and he will rule. He has all the power to do that. And he comes in judgment. It wasn't the Medo-Persians taking Babylon. It's God. God says it's ended, and God brought it to an end. God divided it between the Medes and the Persians. And he can divide our country and take it asunder. That's why we are the greatest help for our nation when we're holy people and fearless and devoted to God and will serve God even if it means our life. And when you take away the fear of death, you have no power. You have no power over God's people. And God has given us a word in order to create that type of faith in us. That's why we saw at Habakkuk, the righteous shall live by faith. You trust me? I will discipline you. I may bring your nation to an end, but we'll continue on. And we'll find a way to promote the kingdom of God, even when we don't have the liberties that we have. I appreciate the prayers that say we want that to continue, but if it doesn't, may we be like New Testament Christians. And may that vision that Ezekiel starts with, he has more visions than Ezekiel. He has more prophecies to give. But the very first thing that he sees, just like Isaiah sees when he becomes a prophet, is God's holiness. God's in control. And he saw this image. He saw this vision that every part of the piece says God's in control. He sees it all. He comes in judgment when he brings nations to bring down nations. And I'm just saying it could happen to any of our nations, and it could happen in our time. I think we've seen a closeness of how invincible, we think we're invincible, we're not anymore. We've seen that in our time, but we never have been. And may we do our best to serve God and promote that cause of Christ, because that's the only thing that can bring peace to people. The peace with God is the only thing that can bring harmony between peoples, that we serve the same God and that we love him with all that we have. If you're not willing to give up your life, you're not Jesus' disciple. And Jesus said that to us. But we, living in the comforts and the things and the freedom we have, sometimes we don't take time to see that side. Hopefully you have a glimpse. But remember, in all of God's wrath, he's faithful. There's a rainbow in that throne. And he'll be faithful to his promises. And he'll help you go through whatever difficulty you have to go through in serving him. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, we want to encourage you to become one. It's not an easy road. I remember when I became a Christian, I had an older lady tell me, "It's not going to be easy, Jerry." And I said, "Oh, what a downer. I just was baptized." She's right. But everybody, everybody's happy for you, and you're a Christian now, and sin's washed away. I feel good that night. But that still rings in my ear. But how true it is. And it's come into my heart and realize it's not easy. And sometimes we have it easy. What happens when circumstances get difficult? Hey, it's easy. You just keep serving God. God's faithful. If we are faithless, he's still faithful. He cannot deny himself. And therefore, we just go through the process, whatever it takes, because we know that we have eternity with him in all of his glory. And what Ezekiel saw brought him to his knees to see the glory and the awesomeness of a God coming in judgment. And may it impress us to realize, I see it too, Ezekiel, but it gives me hope that in time, I will never be separated from my God. In time, I will never. I certainly don't want to be separated in eternity. I don't care what happens to this nation. I will not in time be separated from you and your faithfulness. Now, let's go about trying to save our country, save souls, let righteousness be a part of our country again, and we'll be pretty good patriots when we do that. If you haven't started the walk of serving Christ, we encourage you to become a Christian. Let God bring you into a heavenly kingdom, that you can have that set aside as you serve mankind, as you serve God and therefore serve mankind. You can do that tonight and be a Christian, have your sins washed away, knowing that the road's going to be difficult, but it's a glorious road. You'll never regret it. If we can assist you in becoming a Christian, come as we stand, as we sing.